Hello, welcome back.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I've been away, so it was nice to have a little break, and yeah, good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back, and I think it's so important to kind of have those breaks away and reset a little bit. But it's lovely to have you back. And hello to everyone.
Hi
Uh,
everyone.
so I'll introduce our topic today, and bear with me on this one because I know a lot of people might hear this and think, "Oh, I don't want to listen to that." But there's value in it, and you will by the end. So today we want to talk about death. And I think the reason I gave that kind of warning there is that as a society, generally, we don't want to talk about death. And talking about it seems almost taboo or scandalous or something that is almost, yeah, kind of behind closed doors. It's private. It's not understood as a public thing. So today we want to talk a little bit about how we deal with death as a society, kind of what our cultural relationship with it is, what our kind of mass psychological relationship with it is. Where that's not the case. So in religious traditions and ceremonies, the cases in which we face death and how we do that. But also talking a little bit about our personal relationship with it. So that's kind of, we were thinking about society's relationship, but we were also thinking about our personal relationship with it. So thinking about a great fear of death on one end of the spectrum as a motivation for behavior, and then on the other end of the spectrum, the kind of attraction towards it as suicidal thoughts, suicidal tendencies, seeing it as a position of relief. And then also talking about the benefits of having more of a healthy and kind of welcoming, intimate relationship with death. Not to say that we're necessarily inviting the experience of death, but the topic of death being one that we can handle.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Valentina. That's definitely something to look into, because I think we really want to bring those conversations to you that are often avoided. When we talk about health, when we talk about well-being, when we talk about fullness of life, and the whole experience of what it means to be human, there are some of those topics that we are avoiding, and death is one of them, right? And we take it to extremes, and like you said, Valentina, on one hand we kind of avoid dying at all costs, but also we avoid talking about death. We are really kind of scared of those conversations of this topic. Or on the other hand, we then go to the other extreme and then feel suicidal and want to die. And we really want to open up this conversation to see, what is that happy middle, right? What does it mean to be able to live life fully, without being afraid to die, right? That doesn't mean wanting to die, but just, without, living fully without fear of death. What does it mean? So definitely, there is a question out to you, what's your relationship with death? What is, what comes to your mind when we say, think about death? What's your relationship with that? And what needs to happen for us to redefine those attachments so it's healthier. So Valentina, I know you've done a lot of research from anthropological point of view, right, in terms of kind of our development from spiritual point of view, and our attachment, or our kind of relationship with death is very important in that. So, what could you say about that? How can we really embrace life fully? And how can we embrace the concept of death and be okay with that kind of unavoidable thing of our lives?
Yeah, certainly. So my background researching death has been kind of, yeah, through this anthropological gaze, and looking at how different cultures, different societies and religious traditions and spiritual traditions encounter death and give meaning to it, and what the narratives around death are. But also I volunteer as what's called a non-religious pastoral support volunteer, which is essentially a chaplain, but without kind of coming from a religious discipline. So I'm available to talk to people who are at end of life, or who are, I mean, to be honest, in any situation, often it comes up in existential crises, maybe incarceration, sometimes divorce, endings, things like that, big periods of change. But death and facing end of life, whether it be your own end of life or the end of life of a close friend, relative, partner, is something that comes up a lot. So when we think about our cultural relationship to death, and when I say I'm talking about kind of the dominant Western secular society. And so we have quite an avoidant coping style with death. So when we think about an avoidant coping style, we're thinking about anything that kind of enables us to not deal with it, or not face it, not encounter the true depths of the emotion that come with facing or talking about experiencing death. So we don't talk about it openly. We lie to kids about it to protect them. And when we do talk about it, it's often in a very kind of tentative way, and in very morose, sinister tones. And while this is usually done to show respect and to avoid triggering difficult emotions, like with anything, an avoidant coping mechanism usually results in greater suffering and difficulty attributing meaning and purpose to those experiences. And it's that act of attributing meaning and purpose to an experience that allows us to integrate it into our narrative of life, and allows us to accept it as part of our experience, as an event, something that's happened. And so while there are kind of a lot of instances in which we are forced to then encounter death in a more intimate way, so normally it's when someone close to us has died. And if you're from a religious background, there's a lot of rituals and practices which facilitate that kind of closer relationship or closer encounter with the fact of death. So things like open casket ceremonies, rituals that encourage us to talk about the departed, that encourage others to come, so family members, friends, to come and gather, pay respects and memories to the families and to the people who have died. And so we do have a lot of these ceremonies, and often we, especially for kind of people who've grown up primarily within this secular Western society, to then engage in those rituals can be quite difficult. I mean, it's difficult encountering death in any circumstance, because it's hard. It involves grief. It involves a letting go, which we struggle with generally. And so it can be very hard to then engage in these rituals in a way that really appreciates the meaning, or the intended meaning and the intended benefit of them.
And I think what is interesting there is, like you say that, there is this kind of nearly kind of a sinister negative attitude to it, from kind of Western societies. When you look at a lot of different cultures, there is a recognition in the process, or kind of a cycle of death and rebirth, as just a kind of a normal part of life, and therefore it is embraced as something that has to happen and will happen. And it's kind of the fear of death is like trying to avoid unavoidable, right? So we are really consuming a lot of energy by putting those kind of fearsome values on our children, on our society. And one thing that we have in Lithuania, for example, and 1st of November, for example, there is this day of kind of all dead souls in a way, right? And kind of you're celebrating kind of the continuity and kind of the passage between this life and the other life, and the connection between the two worlds. So they're not necessarily seen as kind of that separate, but it's also, traditionally, I know now as well, like a lot of those traditions are changing, as people are kind of, celebrating Halloween and so on. I feel we should have done this topic, back in November, but anyway, I think there are a lot of cultures that kind of embrace these different aspects in a different ways. And for example, in Lithuania, we don't, celebrate Halloween. It's not like this happy, masquerade that, people have in the US and kind of here. But it's a time of quiet reflection, and it's a time of gathering with families, and it's a time when you go and visit your older relatives, and you do that very purposely with the intention of really cherishing that moment that you have left with them. But you also go and put a candle on a cemetery for every person that you know. And what this means that on the night of that day, you have these most amazing views where you have cemetery covered with candles, and it's just beautiful. It's really breathtaking view when you look at that, and when you are in that environment and you just kind of recognizing that um, kind of a memory of that person and lighting that candle. Is a very, very special environment. And also, there are some other processes where, for example, on a Christmas Eve, you would leave an empty seat and you still dress a table and leave a plate for a person who has died that year. And you're kind of making that space, and you're making that, even though it is a celebration as a Christmas time, you're actually including and you're still remembering that, that person is missing here today. But it's not done with grief. It's done with a place of inclusion and remembering and kind of cherishing those, beautiful memories of, what we had and what we shared. And I think, some of those things are really missing in our kind of Western world, and we kind of tend to have those extremes that I think also the more we fight this nature of ourselves, kind of the fact that we will die, we also creating a lot of kind of dysfunctions in our mental health and well-being, because we are not living fully and healthily in that way. We are essentially quieting down certain aspects of ourselves, by not embracing this full aspect of what it means to be alive. And I believe our suicides, feeling suicidal, also is part of that, of our inability as a society to talk about death, to talk about not wanting to live, and really including that into those daily conversations, so that feeling suicidal becomes stigmatized and something that is seen as really bad and wrong, where actually most people have those thoughts in our lives. It's what matters is what we do with those thoughts, and how it kind of propels us to take specific action, and to connect with others, and to change specific things in our life, and seek help and so on. And it's not really happening because we are really suppressing those topics in our society.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important to kind of note the way that we do suppress it often. And so it means that, like, I really love this tradition of setting a place at the table for at Christmas for those who may have died that year. And because what that does is it really enables us to hold death and life in the same instance. And I think that's something we struggle with so much because of this avoidance with death and this fear of death, because it means that then when we do think about it, we do talk about it, we do let it into our minds, it becomes all consuming, because it's been this thing that we've been pushing away and pushing away and pushing away. And so when we do allow it in, or it invites itself in unannounced, then it becomes totally consuming, and it means that exacerbates the fear, that exacerbates our relationship with it, that says, I can't handle this, I can't bear the weight of death. But if we allow it in, if we leave that door open and we allow it to come in and sit down at our table and sit next to us, and we encounter death and the absence of loved ones at the same time as feeling their presence, then we can enable a relationship with it where we can start to actually see the meaning and the beauty in it. And I think it's important, you kind of, we mentioned about how death is something, it's, we know we will all face it. It's, in fact, it's the only certainty of life, that it will come to an end and it will cease. And that is what makes it beautiful, because it's then something that's precious. It's something that we have to be grateful for, because it is impermanent. And, with like death presents in equal parts to life, that death is in fact the very foundation of life. Without it, there's no cycle, there's no ability to kind of continue on and use and have resources change shape, and to have growth. And so things like, by allowing conversations about death, engaging in rituals just like this, of kind of going and laying candles for those who have passed, or recognizing significant events. And, I think we have a lot of practices around, even when older relatives, I'm sure a lot of people will encounter this, older relatives might talk about their own death and say, well, I don't know how much longer I'll be here, or things like that. And often our response is, no, don't say that. I don't want to think about you dying, which is fair enough. It's not a nice thought, but it's one that we're going to have to encounter at some point. And it might be nice to actually have that conversation with someone while they're living, rather than trying to make sense of it only after they die and you can't have a conversation about it. And so incorporating a healthy relationship with death can do a lot of good. So I want to highlight a handful of points with this. First being that it widens our perspective. So it enables, by inviting in the topic of death and understanding of death, we see our existence as part of a multi-generational continuum. We're not just focused on the narrow, our everyday lives, finding pleasure and happiness within the confines of, let's say a maximum 80 to 100 years, if you're really lucky, span of time. But we actually widen our lens to think about multiple generations. I mean, there's this tradition within Native American Indians of thinking about the 7 generations and 7-generation thinking. And that gives rise to an approach to life which encourages you to think about your legacy and the impact of your life beyond the experience of your life itself. It allows you to think about it within the context of an enduring future, and encourages us to act with greater mindfulness, with greater empathy, and greater attention to those around us, the future and the past, what we want to carry on with and what we want to give to the future.
Yeah, I really like that concept of thinking kind of intergenerationally, and really understanding our existence that is just beyond our life, and it's beyond our birth and death, right? And there is this kind of continuity of life beyond those boundaries. And it is very interesting as well. Recently I've been kind of reflecting on some of kind of my ancestry, and did a little bit of a kind of digging and exploring and so on. And it was very, very interesting to kind of map out, all of my family tree, and actually kind of see the history and see the patterns, what kind of stories are actually repeating itself, from generation to generation, and what is the mechanism of this being passed on, right? And it's very, very interesting when you start reflecting on this, that some of our stories, some of our histories that we kind of manifest in our lives are not even our own, right? We are carrying certain pain, we are carrying certain kind of unresolved missions, some unfair injustices. They are somehow imprinted genetically, they are somehow, we're carrying them in whatever ways you want to see them, spiritually, genetically, emotionally. But it's very, very important to kind of think deeper and then understand, like, what is my history, and then what is my legacy? How can I be a catalyst of change? And if you see some of those unhelpful patterns repeating, and you can sometimes see some very unhelpful patterns, right? You see some families carrying, a pattern of abuse, of discrimination, of addictions, and so on. If you see those unhelpful patterns, specific mental health conditions, what can you do to break that pattern so that you can build that better future for your children, for your next generations? How can you break that cycle and kind of change the course of that direction? So yeah, we can have kind of a brighter future of that. And I think that's really the power of thinking about death not just as an ending but actually as an opportunity to start a new cycle. I think
Absolutely.
it's our ego that is afraid to die, but when we think about the concept of being human, of kind of the spirit of the existence of humanity, then there is nothing to be afraid of, right?
Absolutely. And it's identifying with a grander identity. So, whatever that might be to you, for someone who is part of a religion, you might think of that as God, you might think of that as nature, the universe, you might think of it as humankind, whatever. But allowing yourself to expand your conception of identity to inhabit not just your own ego, but might be your family, your lineage, your national identity. It might be your kind of your racial identity. It might be your spiritual identity. It could be, being part of the natural world and this huge grand ecosystem. So that, yeah, just like you say, it really enables us to think about what we want to continue and what we want to leave behind. And leaving something behind isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think we struggle with that because we struggle with letting go, as I said, but it's about making space. So I think that was really nice what you said about what death gives us, and by kind of accepting death and letting go. And letting go doesn't mean forgetting, but letting go of an attachment means allowing yourself to enter new territory as well. But it opens new space, and we can only, we can't have everything and keep having more and more and more. We need to let some things go, and death is nature's way of ensuring that that happens.
Yeah.
And
And I think, when we get to that kind of end of life, I think, the question here, and again, this is something for question for everyone who's listening as well, how can we live life without regret, right? How can we get to that end point in life and think that I've achieved everything that I was here for, right? I'm happy, I'm fulfilled, and I'm happy to go, right? I'm happy to kind of pass it on and so on. And it's really it can be a really powerful question, because I think very often we get lost in this kind of materialistic way of living and chasing superficial goals and ideals, and then further down the line we look back and think like, yeah, but what was that for? I got here, I achieved this, I built that, but at what cost? That doesn't make me happy, that doesn't make me more fulfilled, that doesn't make me more that doesn't feel like I'm contributing something useful, right? And I think and you will relate to this from a perspective of a coach, for example, right? As most clients come to us with some sort of existential crisis in their lives, needing some sort of help and support. And a lot of those things is coming from the fact that people don't feel like they're aligned with their own path, with their own with their own kind of story of how they would like their life to be told, right, after they are no longer here. And thinking about death, and asking our clients those questions, on that last day, on your deathbed, when you're looking back, what would you've done differently? How does your life look like from that point? It is a very powerful reflection. And like you said, very often, when some of our older relatives start talking about, I'm going to die soon and so on, and we kind of shush them and say like, don't talk about that, I don't want to hear that. what would happen if instead we open that conversation into saying, yeah, tell me about what does it feel like to be thinking
Yeah.
this? What does it feel like to be at this point? What do you regret the most in your life? What you are proud of the most? What are some things, some lessons that you would like to pass on to me before you go, right?
Yeah.
And we often don't have a courage to ask those questions. And then we realize that when the person is no longer there, we realize how much we wish we would have talked, how much we would have asked. But because of that fear of death, we avoid those really, really important topics, and we avoid a lot of life lessons and the
Mm.
deeper meaning and connection with some of these people who are very special and precious in our lives, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important thing to pay attention to. So, what does
Mhm.
our avoidance of death mean for our existing relationships? And not only do we often not talk about certain things or ask certain questions because we don't want to encounter the thought of someone's death, but we also, on the flip side of that, when we push the idea of someone's death so far away that it's an impossibility to us, we
Mm.
couldn't possibly think of them dying, we also assume unconsciously that they will always be there. And it also means then that we put off difficult conversations, we put off questions that might be sensitive or personal, or the
Mm.
kinds of questions that might elicit difficult emotions. And it's often then when those people pass that we think, damn, I really wish I'd asked what their favorite food was when they were a kid, or I really wish I'd asked what their perspective on love and romance was, or I really wish I'd asked them what they thought about their own death or how they felt when experiencing the death of others. And there's so many elements of our relationships that I think can be enriched by this
Mm.
assumption and this constant awareness that someone will die, that the
Yeah.
end of our life may happen sooner than we think, and the end of somebody else's might happen sooner than we
Yeah.
think.
And I think including some of those conversations in our lives and our relationships with our loved ones also helps us to already process grief before
Mm,
death even happens, right?
yes.
Because as well, I think, we have very dysfunctional ways of coping with death, and grief becomes more than we can cope with, more than we can deal with. It's so often something that sends someone on a spiral of depression and complete despair, and not even wanting to live ourselves when we lose our loved ones. And if we really redefine our relationship with that concept, and if we have those conversations, it can really open up our eyes into kind of those possibilities of how does the life look like without this person, but also how this person will always be here with me,
Mhm.
whether they are dead or alive, right? And knowing how to
Absolutely.
carry them with us, how to cherish little moments. And I think if we're having those more open conversations about, little precious things that we can share, little lessons, little, sometimes really, really these kind of life lessons really that we can learn from older people, or again, even kind of our partners. We in our own age, right? We don't have to always think of older person. We think
Yeah.
about colleagues, we think about friends, we think about siblings, right?
Yeah.
What would it look like if if one of us would die, right? What would happen to our kids? What would happen to our house, our finances, so on. It's just like really not being afraid of those conversations, being ready for whatever. And as it might not be pleasant to have those conversations, but it often brings deeper connection in that
Mm,
relationship, and it elicits a lot of other values about what kind of impact we want to make, what kind of legacy we want to leave behind.
Yeah.
And it's very important because once we know that, we can really help that person to support us on the journey. We can really help each other to, yeah, live life without regrets, right? And so I think definitely those conversations are so crucial for the strength of relationships. Either that's with our parents, grandparents, or our siblings, partners, children.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think this, just you're absolutely right when you say kind of talking about death and welcoming conversations and topics of death helps us process grief, because it also facilitates a continued relationship with the dead. And so when I talk about that, I know people who have lost parents or loved ones, and the only way that they know how to cope is through avoidance, not talking about it, not going to places that remind them of that person, distracting themselves from grief at significant times like birthdays and anniversaries. And all of this is natural. It's encouraged by our society. So it's not, no one's doing anything wrong by processing grief that way. But I don't think it's always helpful. And so, for context, my mother died when I was 24, but luckily by this point, I'd already done quite a lot of reading and reflection on the meaning of life and death. I'd gone through therapy. And so, as far as anyone can be prepared for the death of a parent in your 20s, which is always going to be a slap in the face, no matter what, I was relatively well prepared for it, kind of in that philosophical sense. And what that enabled was that I kind of went into it really being aware that I didn't want to engage in this kind of avoidance. And part of that came from a motivation of not wanting to push away my mum's presence. I couldn't have her continued physical presence in my life, but there were so many things that held her presence, things that she gave me, things that she really liked, like her values, even like the sound of her laughter, and how there are certain behaviors or facial expressions or kind of dynamics that I know that I continue because she was my mother and I'm kind of her next evolution, which is also a way that I like to think about kind of the continuation of life. And it means that I can engage with those things and I can welcome her presence whilst being more practiced and able to hold her absence. And that's the hard thing, because normally when we are struck by someone's presence after their death, we are overwhelmed by their feeling of absence, because that is the thing that we've been pushing away and we haven't made our peace with that absence. And being able to hold the absence enables me to then hold her presence. So there'll be, I'll in a moment where, sometimes it can just be the smell in the air or the environment, or like something she liked. Like she really loved those, like, I've forgotten what they're called, but those Portuguese custard pastries. And anytime I see them in a bakery, I sort of stop and think about her and like really feel her presence. And it means that not only am I holding her memories and am I holding her life, but all of these things, pastries, the grass, certain cosmetics, all of these things are holding her life to me. I have that all around me and I can engage with that in different ways. And it's never going to be the same as someone making continued memories or new impacts on your life. But actually, a lot of the time, those memories and that presence continues to impact your life in a way that is different and changes as time goes on, and you change and develop and you take different meaning from it. And so I think it's a really useful tool, if you are experiencing grief, is to try and create some safe spaces for yourself to hold that person's presence and to really come close to their absence at the same time. Because practicing that and practicing sitting with their absence will really enable you to kind of go about your life without fear of coming into contact with that grief, because it is so overwhelming and it's so painful. It's really painful, but we can learn to bear pain, and in learning to bear pain we also open ourselves up to pleasure as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing, Valentina, and definitely some of those, personal experiences and kind of going through this kind of learning to accept death, before it even happens, and losing your, you could say the most important person in your life, right? It's like the part of you also dies with them, right?
Mm,
And it leaves that void in you, and it's the question, what can I fill it with? And that void has to be filled with something that that person has left for you. And these are not material things. These are not, necessarily kind of tangible things that can glue our heart together. But it's really, like you say, some of those, memories, some of those precious, precious little things that allow you to feel the presence of this departed person, regardless of, whether they are here or not. And I think, this is probably the, beautiful question to ask is how this departed person, how their presence still lives in you, right?
mm,
And if you can manage to do that, if you can manage to keep that part of that person alive in you, within yourself, that will help to cope with grief. That will help to heal. That will help you to process their loss, and will actually see the beauty and the continuity in the lessons, and the reasons for life happening as it is, with all of these ebbs and flows, and so on, right?
mm,
So yeah, that's the question to put out there, right? It's like how this person their presence still lives in you, and
mm,
especially it can be very, very hard to find those things when person departs unexpectedly, when someone takes their lives, when someone has some terminal illness and dies, really at the time when, and the age where nobody was expecting of them, when you have some tragic accidents. Those are really things that take us by surprise, and we can never be ready for them. It doesn't matter how much preparation we'll do, we'll never be ready for it. But our ability to then hold our relationship with death in our lives, and have those conversations with other people, and have those conversations with people who are closest to us, can really, really enrich those relationships, and can really kind of prepare us for the worst that can happen. So yeah,
mm.
that's probably kind of a nice little summary to kind of take away, and think about how we can learn from the concept of death, and how is your relationship with it, and what is it that you can do to keep some of those memories of other people, so it doesn't crush you in that way, but also how you can use that concept of it to improve your relationships with people who are the closest to you in your life right now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I'm kind of nothing to add to that, because I think that's a really beautiful point to end on, and a nice thought for reflection.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We'll leave it at here, and if you have any other thoughts, questions, and reflections, feel free to share with us in the comments, and we'll speak to you next week. Bye then.
Bye.